Hi, and welcome to this captivated audience case study podcast. We'll be recording a series of case study podcasts designed to provide you with some insights on recent financial crime cases. We'll be looking at their background story, the illicit actors involved, and also the tactics they use to either circumvent controls or perhaps how controls inside financial institutions fail to detect their activity. And along the way, we'll also leave you with some interesting tidbits about some of the characters involved. Now, our podcast will usually include a couple of speakers, but for today's case, I'll be flying solo, so to speak. So, if you'd like to watch this podcast, we've included some illustrative slides that explain the information I'll be describing, or feel free just to listen to the podcast either way. So, let's get started with our first case study podcast, and it's entitled It's a Family Affair, the Stratos Sanctions Case. So last week, a gentleman by the name of Ali Sadir Hashiminejad, who I'll refer to as Ali for the rest of the case study, was found guilty of 5 counts of sanction violations in relation to the IEEPA sanctions that relate to Iran, as well as money laundering. Now, some news agencies are reporting that Ali is expected to appeal his conviction. So the contents of this presentation are based on the court materials and other information I was able to locate in the public domain about the initial court proceedings and where he was found guilty. So at a headline level, Ali was found guilty of using the US financial system to make a series of transfer payments totaling $150 million. And those were in relation to a project in Venezuela, and the payments were made for the benefit of a company in Iran called Stratos. Now, the relevant period of time is between 2010 and 2014, and you'll see why that's relevant in a moment. And the main beneficiaries of this scheme were a company called the Iranian International Housing Corporation, or the double IHC, and that's because it was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Stratus Group. And the fact that because of that, the owner of the double IHC and the Stratus Group were Ali's father, Mohammed, and other immediate members of his family. But as we'll see later in the podcast, Ali also personally benefited from the payments that were derived from the project, and that included, believe it or not, an investment in pistachio nuts. But more on that later. So more seriously, however, Ali's been at the center of a story concerning Pilatus Bank in Malta, and you've probably heard about this, but just to give you some context, Pilatus Bank was licensed to operate as a bank in Malta in 2013. And there has been extensive media coverage about alleged connections between this bank and the Azerbaijan ruling family who supposedly made secret investments. Sadly, however, this case is probably more well known concerning the murder of a journalist who was investigating allegations of money laundering in relation to that bank. So, how this is actually connected to the current case is that it is believed that some of the money derived from this Stratos project was actually then used by Ali as part of his seed money to set up the capital for Pilatus Bank in Malta. Okay, so let's get to the sanctions part of things, because I think before I dive into everything, you need a really quick overview of the Iran sanction regime and how it works in the United States. Now, this is not going to be a Sanction 101 course, so I'm just briefly going to go through some key points. So most of you will know that the US has a sanction regime in place in relation to Iran. Now, many of you have also heard about the JCPOA, and that was first signed in 2015, and the US was a part of that agreement. In a nutshell, that agreement removed a number of the restrictions around doing business with Iran. Now, they weren't all completely removed for US citizens. But it's important to know the US then, as everyone hopefully knows by now, withdrew from that agreement in 2018. So most importantly, the time frame between 2010 and 2014 of this case means that those transactions took place before the JCPOA was in effect. So any exceptions that were lifted under the JCPOA aren't relevant in relation to this case. So the secondly is the issue of U-turns. So just quickly to explain what a U-turn transaction is. These are transactions involving Iran in this case that were permitted provided they originated from a non-US bank and then they finished or ended up with a recipient who was also another non-US bank. So that allowed transactions to clear through a US correspondent bank in the middle, and they were fine to do provided they didn't end or begin in the United States. Now, there were a number of restrictions regarding U-turn payments in 2008, and by 2012, they'd been removed in their entirety. So you were not allowed to do them. So you remember the time frame I mentioned about this case? It essentially means, and without going into detail, the transactions in this case, although might look like U-turn payments, they weren't permitted under the restricted provisions concerning U-turn payments that the US had in place. So don't get distracted by those, and we're not going to talk about that, and that's the reason why. Okay, so what we're talking about here is a really, really strict sanction regime imposed by the US on Iran. And the main risk for financial institutions who deal with Iran is where there's a US nexus. So for this case study, just understand that using US currency and using a US bank to clear US currency transactions, such as using a correspondent bank, creates that connection or nexus to the US, and that's what makes their sanction restrictions applicable. Okay, so back to the case study. So a little bit more information about Ali. What's his background that proves so useful in this case? Well, at the time of the events that took place, Ali had been operating for some period of time an investment business based in Switzerland, where he was focusing on commodities trading. And there's evidence that he was familiar with the setup and operation of various corporate structures as part of those activities. He'd also studied for a period of time in the United States and owned some property in Florida. So that's a little bit of background. How did he get involved in this case? Well, so the story goes, under the pleadings of the US proceedings, he was approached by his father to help with the family business Stratos with one of its projects. And what dad mainly needed help with was to find a way that would allow payments to flow from the Venezuelan project back to Iran in US dollars. Right, so let's see how all of this began. So a really simple diagram here if you're following the slides, and I'll describe them as best I can for those of you not able to see them. So as I said before, Ali's family has a business in Iran called the Stratos Group. It's a large conglomerate of different business operations driven out of Iran, headed by Ali's dad. So in or about 2005, Stratos began negotiations with the Venezuelan government, and in particular, its large government entity, PDVSA, for a construction project for a large housing facility, if you like, or a neighborhood, for want of a better description. So after a few years of discussions, the parties reach an agreement and they enter into a contract for the work. And they do this by taking one of Stratos's entities, the IIHC, and they create a branch of that company. And they base it in Venezuela, and it also has the name the IIHC, and that's important for this case. In turn, the Venezuelan government create their own subsidiary for this project, and that's the party at the other end of this contract. So in total, the contract covers building 7,000 homes, and the overall value of the contract is 475 million American dollars. So Ali isn't just going to help his dad with these transactions. It's important to note he also has a degree of involvement in the project itself. So he is appointed to sit on the project committee, and he helps oversee the project finances. Not only is Ali appointed to this committee, but there are a number of co-conspirators. That's what they're referred to by the American authorities, who are appointed to this committee. And as you'll see later, this will prove really useful. So let's remember, Ali's got some experience setting up corporate structures, but he runs an investment business. So why would he get involved in this? Well, according to the Department of Justice, he was far more involved in this project than what we see on the face of it. So it turned out that Ali's been fairly involved with his family's business. He's helped set up and control numerous overseas companies over the past 10 years, and several had direct or indirect involvement with his dad's business. Both he and his dad had set up a number of different foreign bank accounts in multiple jurisdictions and in various currencies, and they all had substantial assets in them. And also, it turns out that Ali had control over his father's foreign banking accounts and assisted in sending large sums of money around the world using those accounts, including millions of dollars to his mom and his sisters who are based in the United States. So when the project first began, Ali's dad set up two companies. One was in the UAE in a free trade zone known as Cirrus, and a second one was set up in St. Kitts and Nevis called Stratos Global Investments Incorporated. Now, that structure was initially set up to receive payments from Venezuela in euros. However, the payments didn't go directly to the IIHC in Iran. So, what would happen is Venezuela would pay the IIHC branch in Venezuela. It would then transfer the funds to a bank account opened for Cirrus in the UAE. And the reason it did this was it claimed that Cirrus was its agent or nominee who would receive the payments on behalf of the IIHC Stratus Group in Iran. And then they would make arrangements from that UAE account to forward the money onward to Iran. So this arrangement worked great for the euro payments, and approximately 11.3 million passed through in this way. So there were some problems at this point when we got down to, well, now there is a need to receive payments in US dollars. So not only were there challenges here in relation to the Iran connections I mentioned about the family having their business in Iran and his dad being based in Iran and the name of the company using the word Iran, but it turns out that dad and Stratus Holding controlled other businesses based in Iran, and those businesses had ended up being named on sanction lists related to Iran by the USA. So there's lots of ways in which their connection to Iran was really obvious. So how do you get payments in US dollars through the US and back to Iran without people knowing? So the first step, how do you muddy that connection? Well, it turns out Ali already had spent time in the US as a student. So people initially think, well, that must be the way that he did it because he received a student visa. Obviously, he's bought some property. Remember, I mentioned those pistachios? They'll come back in a moment. But actually, he didn't use that route to try and facilitate these payments. What they actually did was they started off first by finding a way to conceal their connection to Iran by changing their nationality. So what they did was they retained a firm who specializes in obtaining investor visas, or what we usually call them golden visas. And usually the way these work is you make a substantial investment in the country in question who's going to issue you the passport. And in return, it shows that your citizenship is based in that country. And that's exactly what they did. So father and son paid $250,000 each, and they each received passports that identified their country of citizenship as Kittish. And for those of you who don't know what country that is, that's St. Kitts and Nevis. So remember those two companies I mentioned earlier that Dad set up, the one in the free trade zone and in Nevis? Well, it turns out that he actually used this Kiddish passport when he was asked to prove his nationality when he opened the bank accounts for them. So clearly Dad was already on the ball in terms of taking this first step of concealment. So let's think about the next step. So we now have some new identification documents. Now what happens? Well, using the new passport, along with an address in the UAE, Ali went about arranging for the formation of two more companies. So the first one that's formed is called Stratus International Contracting JS, and it was formed in Turkey. So we're just going to call it Stratus Turkey. Now that company, according to its corporate records, is owned 90% by Ali, his dad, and his sister. A remaining 4% is owned by one of those co-conspirators I mentioned, and we're not sure what happened to that other 6%. But Ali is appointed as the chairman of Stratus Turkey. He then makes sure he has the right arrangements in place by opening a US dollar bank account with a Swiss bank on which he's the sole signatory to the account. He then sets up a second company called Clarity Trade and Finance. And the records for it record its activity as intending to be trading in agricultural commodities. Now, we're not sure how the shareholding worked for this entity, but we do know that Ali was identified as its president. And so Ali, again, using his ID, went and set up a US currency account with the same bank that he opened the one with Stratus Turkey. And he also set up this other temporary account with a different Swiss bank. And we understand from the court material that Ali had represented to the bank that the intention was that the owners of Clarity would eventually become his immediate family members. So, what do we do now? Well, step three. And the final step to cutting obvious connection to Iran is to employ the same tactic his dad used with the Sirius entity and getting payments from Venezuela. So, what they did was they appointed Clarity and Stratus Turkey essentially as the nominees to receive payments on behalf of the IIHC back in Iran. So, what that means is these companies appeared on payment messages as if they were the ultimate beneficiaries of the payments that were being made. So, if you look at the screen, you can see how the flow of transactions worked. Essentially, Venezuela would pay the IIHC branch in Venezuela. They would then send a payment instruction that would have US dollars pass through American banks. They would then arrive at the Swiss bank accounts that Ali had opened, and they would either go into the bank account for Stratus Turkey or they would go into the bank account of Clarity. And so once these arrangements were put in place, the next step, just to be absolutely sure this would work, is Ali would provide very clear instructions by email to his co-conspirators about exactly how they needed to write the payment instructions. So for those of you following the slides, you can see an email from the court proceedings showing Ali being very specific about exactly what needed to be written for those payment instructions. So now the folks involved in this scheme are not naive. So they've already anticipated that the Swiss bank is likely to start asking questions about the two companies, Clarity and Stratus Turkey. Because once the payments start to arrive and they're coming from Venezuela and they have reference to some sort of housing project, they're going to want to know, well, how are Clarity and Stratus Turkey involved in that project? So what do you think the solution might be? Well, if, like in 1MDB, the Malaysian sovereign wealth scandal, you're lucky enough to have an insider at the bank, which is what happened there, it certainly makes things much easier. But this didn't have the convenience of an insider. So, what did the folks do in this case? Well, to deal with any questions that might be asked, they came up with a very, very clever idea. And I'll try and explain this as easily as possible. One of the co-conspirators arranged to write a letter on IIHC letterhead to the Swiss bank explaining that the arrangements, although sounding a bit complicated, were for perfectly legitimate purposes. And what excuse did they give? Well, they gave the excuse that's familiar to all of us, which is any reference to Iran on any payment transaction, even if it is permitted by the US sanction regime, is still problematic because the way that our transaction monitoring tools are configured, those transactions immediately get picked up and there is an alert raised. So they write to the Swiss bank and give them comfort to say, no, don't worry. These are legitimate transactions, but because the constant trigger and the holding up of transactions whenever the word Iran is there, we've decided to make sure that Clarity and Stratus Turkey are the ones who receive the payments. That way we won't have all sorts of holdup and problems for receiving the payments. So you can see what's going on here. It's a little bit looking like, oh, well, this is like a U-turn payment, except for the U-turn payments didn't apply. The payment was coming from Venezuela, and they made it appear as though it was ending in Europe. But in actual fact, the proceeds at the end of the day were going back to Iran. So this worked really well. And in total, Clarity received 8 transactions. Stratus Turkey received the other 7. And that's how the total of 115 million made its way from Venezuela out through the US into Europe. Now, all good things must come to an end. And we're not entirely sure what transpired. But sometime in 2011, Ali and his co-conspirators started exchanging correspondence about the need to change details. There is some evidence that a couple of the correspondent banks started asking questions about the transactions, but it's not sure that's what triggered these folks needing to come up with more tactics. All we know that something is wrong and discussions start between the folks involved to further conceal the connection to Iran. Now, there's 2 possible sources to the problem here. Now, remember with Stratus Turkey, the family are identified as the beneficial owners. So maybe it's that KYC that information that is somehow causing a problem because they haven't tried to conceal their identity as the shareholders or Ali's involvement as the chairman. Or maybe the problem is the actual transaction messaging that's going through. Maybe there's still information being put on the transaction messages that allow people to realize there's a link to Iran. So, if those are the two possibilities, what are your options to address it? Well, if the problem is the KYC, you can take a couple of steps to try and further conceal the connection of these people to Iran. First, you could literally change the name of the shareholders, or you could use nominee shareholders to hold the shares on behalf of the Hashemite family. Ali could use a power of attorney and have somebody else actually act as the chairman of the business on his behalf. You could create legal entities and try and go through a series of holdcos to actually own Stratos Turkey, or maybe you could just transfer the shares that the family holds to newly created companies to try and distance their association. And you'd incorporate them in different jurisdictions. So there was talk even of setting up a company in Austria, although that never went ahead. But if the problem is the transaction monitoring, your options are different if you want to conceal the connection to Iran. You could strip the payment messages, but for that, you'd need an insider at the bank to help you to do that. You could omit information on the messages, but as we know, usually these days, screening tools are configured to pick up any sort of omissions. The other options you have is you can change the data that actually appears on the payment messages by changing the name of the payer, changing the name of the beneficiary, and if any further questions are asked about those transactions and what they're for, you could also change the KYC information that you hold about the project itself, who's involved, and who are the ultimate parties involved in that housing construction project to begin with. So let's see what option they decided to go with. Well, it turns out they're not interested in the KYC. They're not seeing that so much as a problem. What they are seeing is the transaction monitoring seems to be the problem for them. So Ali and his co-conspirators come up with a series of measures to try and conceal the transactions, and most significantly, the connection to Iran. So how do they do it? Well, first off, they change the data on the payment messages. So they do two things. First, they try by just using the acronym IIHC instead of writing out the name in full where the word Iran starts the name of the company. Now, that's okay, but if those of you who use screening tools know, that doesn't always make it very effective in terms of trying to hide and get through a screening tool. So then they decide, let's just take the word Iran out of the name altogether. And on the slide, I have an extract of an email exchange between Ali and his co-conspirators, where they confirm for everybody involved that the IIHC is changing its name to just International Housing Corporation due to what they call developing circumstances. Well, what else do they do in terms of transactions? Well, they then make sure that everybody involved in the payment chain only identifies Stratos Turkey or Clarity as the true beneficiaries of the payments. So they again write letters, just as I described before, to the Swiss bank, explaining if you see Stratos Turkey, it's because of the unusual situations regarding payments for Iran. And we have an extract from an email which they've actually sent to the folks at IIHC in Venezuela to say, please make sure when you start sending the money back, you identify the beneficiary as Stratos Turkey or Clarity. So what's the third part of this? Well, before I get to the third part, um, we know that this tactic worked for no other reason than there's an email in the court proceedings that show Ali is telling one of his buddies the strategies work. The money's actually gone through. So he reminds them to keep the information confidential and they'll decide whether to go public. So those first two tactics work very well and the money's going through. But there's one more thing they can do. And this is really interesting. So for those of you familiar with the 1MDB case, you've probably heard about the agreements and loan documentation and other records that were fraudulently created to give the impression that the money stolen actually originated from legitimate activities. What you'll see as a tactic is often contracts are created after the fact, or they're backdated, or they're made up whenever a bank is asking for KYC to explain the nature of funds or the relationship between customers and a third party who appears to be making a payment or receiving a payment from them. So here in this case, there was evidence that fraudulent documentation was created to give the impression of a legitimate business arrangement between Clarity and Stratos Turkey and the branch of the IIHC in Venezuela. So you can see here, if you can see the slide, there were two interesting agreements here. So we have in 2011, finance management contract between those three. So the IIHC in Venezuela, Stratos Turkey, and Clarity. Now remember, the project started earlier than that, and we know that payments went earlier. So there's some suspicion that this agreement may possibly have been backdated. But then there's this second odd agreement called a subcontract between the IIHC and Stratos Turkey, and that's dated 2012. And it again appears to be something to try and give legitimacy to the flow of payments that were coming forward. So this is really interesting. Now, in the court decision, there isn't a lot of focus on these agreements, but consider how you would know whether or not an agreement, if given to you at your request to validate a transaction, was legitimate or not, especially when you're dealing with non-listed entities where information about their business activities isn't available in the public domain. How would you go about making the determination that it's actually real? So what we do know is it worked. And how do we know? Well, we know because there are emails between the parties saying, okay, this tactic appears to have worked. How many advances have we made so far? So we also know it worked because during an interview with the Financial Times, one of the banks that was used in this situation, and it is one of the Swiss banks, said a banker familiar with the transactions who dealt with Ali told the Financial Times that the bank's impression was that the business was conducted between a Turkish company and Venezuela. He said there was no indication that the end beneficiary was an Iranian company. All the contracts were done by lawyers, properly done, and all the shareholders were outside of Iran, he said. So the banks were successfully fooled. Now, in a final effort to muddy the trail, further changes were made to their payment activities, again to try and make it difficult for the banks to detect the connection back to Iran. You know, sometimes we talk about people being innovative and being able to pivot and incorporate new ideas. Well, these guys were doing this throughout. They were trying to be really good risk managers, but the risk they were managing in this case was detection. So the three additional tactics they employed was they started to use different correspondent banks. Now, why would you do that? Because you don't want one correspondent bank to build up a history of transactions which appear to have a consistent set of parties at the beginning and end. That might raise a red flag. So why not start using a new correspondent bank who's unfamiliar with your pattern of transactions? Use different entities. In one case, they actually passed a payment via a correspondent bank in the US through a different Swiss bank and then onward to the bank accounts for Stratos Turkey or Clarity, again creating that distance and difficulty in understanding, well, where did these monies come from in the first place and where are they going? They then started to alternate as a second tactic the beneficiaries they showed on the payments. So sometimes Stratos Turkey would be paid for a period of time, but then it would switch to Clarity. Again, you get the idea. You're trying to reduce the amount of data that the banks themselves can see in terms of a pattern of transactions. And finally, remember that temporary account? Well, they decided to revive and start using that account, again, because there was no records there about previous payments and hopefully would not raise any red flags about patterns of activity. So really, when you think about this, it's really well planned and rather ingenious. So you're probably wondering, where did the money go? Well, this is really interesting. So um, what they managed to find out in the US when these proceedings were brought was that the money that was in the bank accounts in Switzerland were all transferred to a BVI company that Ali and other people had set up sometime in 2009. There was a bank account opened for that BVI company, and transfers came from it. Most of the money went back to Iran eventually, and some money went back to bank accounts that were controlled directly by Ali. So what did Ali do with the money that he personally benefited from in relation to this Venezuelan housing project. Well, according to the bail application, which was made at the start of the proceeding after Ali was arrested, the money really was used rather efficiently by him. So over 1 million Swiss francs and 8 million euros was used, as I mentioned earlier, to help him establish the capital for the Pilatus Bank in Malta. He then bought an apartment in Washington, D.C. that was worth about $1.5 million. And remember those pistachio nuts? Well, he invested $5.7 million of those proceeds to buy interests in various pistachio farms. But what was more interesting about the bail application was some information they brought about Ali and his nationality. So they were trying to say that he shouldn't get bail. And some really interesting information they offered was that he had one more passport that was active that he didn't disclose to the authorities. And not only that, but he had a history of obtaining passports from multiple countries using that firm I mentioned earlier who helped people get those golden visas. They also found that he had companies in a number of different jurisdictions, including the US, Malta, Hong Kong, Cyprus, and the UK. And the records for all of those companies did not show his connection to Iran in any way. And lastly, you remember my reference to his studying in the US. Well, that just turned out to be a bit of a distraction because in the end, it had no relevance to the transactions. So, anyways, I was interested to hear that he had some sort of connection to the UK and that he had managed to conceal his connection to Iran. So, I did a search on Companies House, and here's what I found. These first two records I found for Ali, there were some interesting discrepancies, and the most obvious one was his date of birth. And it turns out that he had two St. Kitts passports with different dates of birth on them. And not only that, but different biometric data for each of the passports. So you can see here, he successfully put himself on as an officer of these companies. And also, he identifies his country of residence as England. But this wasn't the only set of records I found for this guy. I also found two more. And again, while this time it appears his date of birth is consistent between these two entities, he's identified two more countries of residence. In one record, it's the UAE, and the second, it's the United States. Remember, I said I'd mentioned some additional tidbits, and I talked about those co-conspirators right off at the beginning. Well, this is a diagram from the proceedings that was trying to explain how the housing project was actually being managed. So I mentioned there was a project committee. There's a gentleman by the name of Bahram Karimi. He's just been arrested and extradited to the United States earlier this year in January. And he too has been charged under the sanction restrictions as well as for attempting to commit bank fraud and making false statements. Now, what's interesting about him is that he's a dual nationality holder as well. So we know he has some connection to the payments and the arrangements that were made because you may have noticed his name earlier on one of the emails I showed. So he was actually managing the IIHC branch in Venezuela. So why do we care that he has a Canadian passport as well as an Iranian passport? Well, this is really interesting. So some writers have informally surmised that because Karimi is a dual passport holder, he's an ideal front person to open accounts or make companies using his Canadian passport. But other people, including a think tank, which looks at illicit financing operations coming out of Iran, says that Karimi is just one example of wealthy Iranian regime-friendly immigrants who use their Canadian nationality to assist companies in Iran. So it's not just an isolated occurrence that Karimi's been involved in this project. So interestingly enough, I did a bit of research with some of our fellow financial crime prevention folks in Canada, and I actually discovered that Iranians in Vancouver, where Karimi was from, are known to engage in a practice called switching out. So what they do is they use their Canadian passport to travel to different countries and set up bank accounts. And it allows them to enter the US as Canadians, and then when they need to travel back home to Iran, they use their Iranian passport. So in all likelihood, Karimi was using his Canadian passport to travel down to Venezuela. Remember, Canada doesn't have restrictions on Venezuela. And then as he arranged bank accounts or setting up arrangements for payments, he would have continued to use his Canadian passport and no one would have been any the wiser as to his connection to Iran. So, a few concluding thoughts on this case study. Interestingly enough, the reason why this whole scam or scheme came about, it started with a whistleblower, believe it or not, at the PDVSA in Venezuela. And it is suggested that at least one of the correspondent banks in the US did finally manage to flag a transaction that looks problematic. And they did actually start to reject transactions, but this happened as late as 2014. So in the first 3 years of this project, it doesn't appear that anybody figured it out or raised an alarm. But I think what's an important thing to take away from this case is that the tactics used not only show that criminals are really creative and will constantly change the measures they use to avoid detection, but this was really focused on transaction monitoring. And these guys clearly had some understanding about how we set up our transaction monitoring tools. And they also understand how we go about validating transactions called into question, hence the fabricated KYC documentation for the project. So going forward, I'm hoping what this case study allows you to think about and maybe take away and ask how might you have detected this is what might you have done to possibly detect this activity? How might you have gone about evaluating project documentation that otherwise offers no further information out in the public domain? And going forward, how might you train your staff up so that they're able to detect transactions which may not have long strings of predictable activity based on the sort of tactics going on here? And perhaps most importantly, given how obvious the information was about Ali's different nationalities and passports, what can we do better to be more alert to those existing KYC reviews in terms of new information we find that might tell us perhaps our client wasn't being as honest as they should have? So I hope you've enjoyed the podcast today, and we really look forward to you joining us to listen to some of our future ones as well. Have a great day and stay safe.